Thanks everybody for joining. Great pleasure to introduce Dr. Daphne LaDue. This probably needs no introduction to any of you. That's why you're all here. Daphne has been at the university since 1995 and is currently a senior research scientist in CAPS, where she was a research associate and a research scientist previously. Daphne did her bachelor in physics with a minor in mathematics at Anderson University in Indiana, and then a master's with Bill Smith Sr. and Steve Ackerman, who I actually know on radiation studies. That's what I love doing these introductions. You learn something new about everybody that you get to introduce. And of course, Daphne got her PhD from this very fine university in adult education in 2011. So very excited, Daphne, for you to give us a presentation. Please take it away.
Well, thank you. It was really, I felt really honored to be asked to do this, in part because there are a lot of other social scientists here at the Weather Center and in our affiliated groups, and any one of them would do an amazing talk, and I hope that they do have opportunities to give a talk as well, because I'd love to hear more about what they are up to. Okay, so I have had many collaborators on the 5 projects that I'm going to cover today, and they are listed on this slide. And then these projects were funded by my dissertation, basically by Jim and me, because I did not ever stop working. So we paid all the tuition. Thank you to OU for the tuition waivers. And then Noah and NSSL have paid for the other grants. Okay, so these are 5 of my favorite projects. The first one I'm going to talk about is my dissertation, and then I'm going to talk about some projects where I had an opportunity to exercise some creativity. So my dissertation was a long-held curiosity, as was the number 5 project on there. 2 and 4 have given me opportunity to exercise some creativity. That's been very fun. And then the 3 in how EMs are dealing, emergency managers are dealing with weather. That one is about sort of easing the pain, if you will. So I'll talk more about that as we go. All right, so forecasters. I had an unresolved mystery of how you learn this when I was taking synoptic lab in grad school at Wisconsin. So, but why would you study forecaster learning? Let's see, let's get Keith in here. Okay. Why would you study forecaster learning? Well, the Weather Service, you know, there are more and more, we're leaning on numerical weather prediction. However, there is a big shift to decision support, and that's really important. And it requires a deep conceptual understanding of the weather and the meaning and how to deal with all that model output. I started my dissertation work in 2003. So this headline was not very old at that point. And those of you who are a little older in the room might remember that the Weather Service had put a new supercomputer in Bowie, Maryland, and said, we are going to be the no surprise Weather Service. Well, guess what? That fed the opportunity for the Washington Post to say blindsided and snowed under. This was one of those big storms that came through, and the Weather Service did a really lousy job with forecasting it. Okay, but also Ken Graham, who you all know now is director of the National Weather Service, he had been at the time working on some experimental pilot projects with the Weather Service back in the 2000s, and he was part of the Deepwater Horizon incident response. And he made this statement that decision support is a massive scientific challenge. You never know what they're going to ask for next. The story behind that is he was part of Deepwater Horizon. The wave height forecasts were the same 2 days in a row, but on the second day, he hears the Coast Guard saying, man, we were really getting beat up out there. And he's thinking, why? The waves were the same height. And it turns out wave steepness is a big deal. He went home that night, Googled, found some papers, attempted to start forecasting wave steepness. And it kind of worked. So that's the kind of people we want to have forecasting the weather for us. All right, so study foundation, relevant literature. I had a really long literature chapter in my dissertation. About 20 pages of it were things that when I'm putting on my meteorology hat now, that we've said about ourselves. And then now I'm going to put on my social science hat and say, then the rest, I looked at things like expertise, adaptive character of thought, reflection and learning and action, self-directed learning, and how career stage and development plays into our learning. Okay, so we take those preconceived ways and ideas of how learning might vary. And this is how I started selecting forecasters to talk to. So time and service, employment sector, public and private, type of forecasting that they were doing, and gender. And then as I'm going along and building theory, I added sense of identity as a forecaster, as an important factor that seemed to be distinguishing my participants from each other. The interview strategy I used, the main question was about what you have learned in the last year, or what you have changed about your forecasting. And then I probed into things like their reasons for learning, the role of context, resources and strategies they used to learn, and the role of social interaction. There are lots of limitations and assumptions that you have to make when you do any kind of work. Mine included things like that learning would not be so overly idiosyncratic that I wouldn't see patterns across forecasters. And it also was that forecasters could describe what they were doing to learn. But of course, if people have poor metacognitive skills, they might not be aware of how they're learning. There are limited demographics in any sample size, especially with forecasting, and that interviews are what people think they do, not necessarily what they actually do. But you know what? My advisor said, hey, look, all research is inadequate. And I'll bet every person in this room can relate to that. All research is inadequate, but you work with it. You do as best job you can. And then study upon study builds things up. Okay, so the hard work of reassembly, I decided to include this for those of you who are have never dealt with social science data, to just kind of give you an idea of what it's like. So you go through an interview and you flag it with all the topics, and interest was one of the topics, like interest in weather. Okay, so then if you're building theory, you're looking at for how that varies across your interview. So with interest, it was weaker interest, stronger interest. And then what did that do? So if the interest was stronger, yes, they were grabbing onto bits. They wanted to know more. Sorry about the writing on here. This is literally when I was playing with data in the library upstairs on a whiteboard. Okay, anyway, so you grab onto bits. Well, sometimes they didn't really try, but sometimes they continued to try. Sometimes they asked other people for help. Sometimes they read things. Even after they read things, they often talked to other people. There's a big social component in learning. Eventually, hopefully, they saw connections and learned. So I came out with this theory. This is my emerging theory about 3 paths to learning. This is the final diagram. Okay, so you enter in at the top. A general inability would be your young forecasters just starting out, but any forecaster could realize they don't know something. Okay, so then you come in this first row up there, others helping or not seeking help. They're either getting high social support or they're not. The next row down, they're learning from others, which also is affirming of you belong here because I'm bothering to teach you, or not affirmed. Now, that's not necessarily the not affirming somebody. Sometimes others could not help because they didn't know either. But there were many cases where others just didn't. They didn't help. And then over on the right, we have a variation between a weak identity and a strong sense of identity. And if someone didn't really have much of an identity about being a forecaster, they didn't necessarily try very hard to learn things. But if they did, they would create strategies and go through sometimes a great deal of effort to learn. And then these paths would either result in putting pieces together and building knowledge or not. Okay, so my dissertation, I'm going to give you a couple QR codes in here and then at the end that you can go look and read more if you'd like. Today, I'm only going to talk about the path 2 and 4. 2 is pretty easy, kind of smooth sailing. The proposition behind this path, which is part of what you're doing in grounded theory, you put out a proposition and you work with it with your data to see if that proposition is describing what it should. So my proposition was forecasters build a useful knowledge structure faster and with help from others. So here are some of the pieces of stories. Raymond, assistant to his first boss, and he kind of emulated his boss. That was part of how he was learning. Tyler was hired to replace the retiring boss, and he got that boss's attention almost exclusively for his last couple months. Forrest moved to a coastal forecast office, and the lead walked up and said, "You have no idea what you're doing, do you?" And then he helped him, which was fantastic. Henry had experienced forecasters that helped him learn a lot faster about how to overcome problems with biases in the models, for example. So this path is relatively quick, good quality learning, affirmation is readily felt. Younger forecasters did not have to seek help. And experienced forecasters learned this way. They would be reflecting on ongoing weather and continuing to learn. Okay, path 4 is the most complicated, but we won't cover like everything. So here the proposition is forecasters with a strong sense of identity will persist through learning and create learning strategies. And here, Cassie was another forecaster who also had never lived near water. And the Sioux said, oh, well, go through these modules, they'll help you. And she's like, she knows, she recognizes already that forecasting is not that simple. If it was that simple, anyone could walk in and do it. They wouldn't need a degree. Like, this is really complicated. So she thought, well, okay. And she asked, can we sit down and talk about it after I do the modules and show me? And they did that, which made her much more comfortable with the marine side of forecasting. Tyler was on the forefront of seasonal forecasting. So this is 15 years ago. He's at a company who that's what he's trying to do is seasonal forecasting. Well, there aren't many people who even try to do that at the time, especially. And so one of the things he needed to do for himself is document his thought processes so that months later he could go back and look at, did my thought processes play out? Can I figure out where I went right and wrong? And he had to do a lot of that for himself. So this is the longest path to learning in terms of time and steps involved, but it's also the most significant to the participants I've talked to. Younger forecasters sometimes had to create strategies to learn the job and understand the science. Like one of them in a private company, the private company said, there's your desk, go. And then at 6 months, they said, you're not doing very well. Like, yeah. Anyway, so some people had to go through enormous effort to learn. And then experienced forecasters were sometimes building on to the science itself in how they were learning. Okay, so to wrap this part up, forecasters learn how to think from other forecasters. This is nonlinear. If they have affirmation, they learn faster and learn more effectively. And then unsupported forecasters tended to succeed only if they had a strong professional identity. My dissertation ended up being most of chapter 3 in Minding the Weather, which I also helped Robert Hoffman finish. He had started the book several years before, but I ended up in second author place because I deserved to. I helped him a lot with finishing that book. And yes, I did ask, but he immediately wrote back and he's like, I was already thinking about that. Yes, you're going to be author 2. And then I got invited to submit a chapter on the domain of weather forecasting to the Oxford University Handbook on Expertise that came out a couple years ago, and that's chapter 38. And you can ask me if you can't access those, I could help you with that. Okay, so coming back to that little quote at the beginning, graduate school me was like, how are we doing this? Dr. me could say, well, I at least know how they are doing this. Okay, so forecasters. This one was an opportunity to be really creative, and I had a great time with this project. We were doing needs identification to understand what weather radar systems needed to be able to do. So we talked to 5 weather service forecasters and 4 TV meteorologists. We did critical incident interviews. That is a technique where you go beyond the generalized statements. So it turns out that we tend to generalize things. It's just easier on our cognition to take the specifics and figure out like, this is the thing, this is how it's working. But if you're doing research on someone, you really need to get beyond those generalized statements, and you need to try to pull out the specifics and get that back out, figured out. So we were looking at for the weather radar study, how weather radars did or did not provide information that was needed. And then on the next study I'm going to cover with EMs, we looked at weather events that had either gone well or poorly due to information from the National Weather Service. The origin of this method came from, well, earlier than in the 50s with the Air Force, but John Flanagan really developed it for the Air Force because they needed to be training pilots, and it tended to be I know it when I see it. And he's like, let's figure out what it is that we're seeing. And so he developed this critical incident technique. Okay, so the BAMS paper has a lot more than what I'm going to show here, but I have the lived experience on the left. And if we look at the top row, Forecasters had seen others manually start a volume scan to get another low altitude scan very quickly. And broadcasters had sometimes just switched to their station radar because they could set it to rapidly update. Now, this was all taken care of with sales, I know. But anyway, we identified that there was a limitation there of the 4 to 6 minute updates. And over on the right is one of my little bits of creativity. I went to the library and I looked at Edward Tufte's books of data visualization. Like, how can I show how well saturated these things are? And I came up with this idea of shading the boxes for my 5 forecasters and my 4 broadcasters. And you can see this whole page, it was almost unanimous, except down there was one broadcaster who didn't mention that third thing. But anyway, these experiences identified these limitations, and we ended up with what we need is higher temporal resolution data. Another thing that we looked at was higher spatial resolution. So there were things that were important that came out. So this one is one that's not, at the top, it's not a limitation, it's a current strength of the radar. Forecasters had used changes in the character of clear air echoes to monitor environmental changes prior to storm formation. So here we've got that the radar was very useful to detecting those changes. Now, only 3 of the forecasters mentioned that particular one, but in any case, you can see that the third one had to do with more of thinking about warnings and what they really want to do. If you've got this tilted over sheared storm, you're probably drawing your warning a little bit bigger. It can be a little bit harder to know where the tornado is. And Doug Spieger had talked to me once about how he'd figured out that there could be as much as an 8-mile displacement between a circulation out far from the radar and its ground location of the tornado. So on both of the groups, forecasters and broadcasters knew how disruptive warnings were to people. So we really need higher spatial resolution data to help with tackling that problem and more low altitude information. Robert Hoffman, in the course of my collaborations and talking with him, said, send that paper to Gary Klein, would you? I want to see, so I'm like, okay, I will. So I sent it to him and he wrote back and he said, I admire your use of the CIT. And I thought, oh, that's cool. Because that's Gary Klein. He's a big name. Naturalistic decision-making. Anyway. Okay, so now we'll go to project number 3. This one is more about easing the pain, if you will. So the EM cycle is there in the upper right, and I focus really on response is the one that it fits under, but looking at the actions carried out immediately before, especially with Vortex Southeast. And if you're familiar with that project in 2016 and 2017, we didn't see much. I also did CIT interviews before a hazardous weather testbed project that I'm not going to talk about today. So I've done CIT interviews with EMs for 2 different projects. I've also done participant observation, and for this project, that's what I'm going to talk about. And then the vulnerability interviews, that's project number 4 that I'll mention a little bit about. The CIT interviews have been published twice. So Sean Ernst helped me analyze one of those data sets. Hi, Sean. And Rachel Cross, I don't know if she's here, but Rachel helped me with another set. And we've got 2 papers out describing those findings. So having a series of funding has been really important and really helpful in seeing contrasts and deepening understanding. And this is just one example. So when Sean and I looked at the pre-hazardous weather testbed interviews, we saw trust throughout the interviews. In Vortex Southeast, it was a little bit different. It was more like there was a strong relationship and a desire for that with the Weather Service, but and the trust was built similarly. However, with Vortex Southeast interviews, the trust was in the forecaster's intent and knowing that they were trying to do a good job, not in the forecast. So these issues of trust led to adapting procedures that EMs would have otherwise been doing. Here are a couple examples of why they need to adapt. And these were a couple of the critical incidents described to me. So Tornado Watch had been out, but it expired. The EOC, that's Emergency Operations Center, closed. But the EM said, I'm going to stay because the sun's been shining all day. And the tornado touched down. And there was another one where the county was not in the tornado watch. And this EM would quip to me every once in a while, in and near the watch area. The EOC was closing for the day. They were not in the watch. But He saw a couple cells pop up to the southwest and thought, I think I'll stick around. And there was a funnel cloud report called the Weather Service. And at the time, I'm not sure they had a good radar, but initially they said, no, we're really not seeing anything. Well, an EF3 tornado occurred. So Alabama EMs have developed over time these strategies to deal with these surprises and try to mitigate against them. Another example is there might not be a watch out, but if a severe thunderstorm warning goes up near some of these counties, they'll go ahead and go in because they are worried that something might surprise them as well. Okay, strengths of our vortex southeast approach. This work was done with Jack Friedman. Prolonged engagement, participant observation. I mean, these were amazing ways to more deeply understand the emergency manager experiences. I got to see context and lots of examples. If I could do it differently, I would have had multiple people because I could only go to one EOC, only one person. All right, so now I'm going to kind of walk you through a day in the life of one of the more exciting days we had. This is going to illustrate some of the EM activities and timeline. Knowledge of what typically happens is going to get a little bit of a rhythm of vigilance in how they're dealing with weather throughout the day, the forecasts and updates, and issues with technical information, and the costs of a null event. It won't illustrate the no notice events like on a couple slides back, and it won't really show how they're adapting to shortcomings in forecasts or consultation with other EMs. And it's not really going to cover decision-making from non-weather service sources. Okay, but here we go. So the day before, 1:30 p.m., National Weather Service does a briefing. There'll be 2 waves of storms tomorrow. Both have the potential to be traumatic. An EM called me afterward and he said, I had that feeling that I was telling you about that I promised I would call you. I have it for this event. Okay, the next day, they had told me they would be there by 8. I got there at 7:40, and 2 of them were already there, and one of them had been there since 7. And the county commissioner was also there. So I got to meet him and see, he was there to see what was happening. A volunteer arrived by 8 and immediately began helping the phones that had been ringing off the hook. People were calling, when will the public tornado shelters open? Remember, this is 8 a.m. for an evening event. Can I sign up for your notification system? How do I program my weather radio? Can I register my storm shelter? Like, just ringing off the hook. And then someone had got off the phone with the sheriff's office and like, they must be getting slammed. They were also getting a lot of phone calls. All right, 8:30 a.m. National Weather Service did a briefing with very little notice, but they announced they would be doing a longer briefing at 11 and that they would send slides beforehand. So the EMs decided to go ahead and sign into the state EOC system and say, we're here, we're monitoring. And they put together a situation report for their local partners in their county. And one of the EMs just kind of voiced out loud, like, we're due. 9 a.m., the EMs do their own local call. There were about 10 people in the EOC and more people on the phone. And they started out saying, we've been receiving a lot of calls for information. The day 1 outlook is out and we're in a hatched area. And then he interrupts himself and looks at me and says, what does that mean? So I answer his question. And then he goes on. Risk has increased since yesterday. SPC has us in a 4 out of 5. This is a little different than we normally see. Often the western parts of the state have a higher risk area. Today is the day we've been planning for since 2011, the big tornado outbreak. Not saying it's going to be that bad, but this is what we've been preparing for. All right, so 11 a.m. It's time for that briefing from the National Weather Service. The room is pretty quiet. It's quite intense. I noted that the WCM was doing the briefing. That usually means it's serious. The WCM said, moderate risk has shifted slightly east. Cloud cover is decreasing. Dew points are going up, which will help prime the atmosphere. We're expecting storms to ramp up. Everything is on the table. Tornadoes, large hail, localized flash flooding. At the end of the briefing, there's always an opportunity for questions. And I think without fail, every time some EM in Alabama would ask this question, are we going to be under a watch? And they said, well, can't answer that right now. No development yet, but my gut feeling, WCM says, is that it would be a tornado watch for Northeast Alabama and potentially Limestone and Madison County, but I'm guessing here. Okay, so now 11:45. There's not much going on right now. I decided to go grab lunch. And so Rachel and I put this graph together. It's not perfect, but bear with me. The idea here is that there's sort of monitoring and action, and one of the lines on here is for the EMs, and it's the purple one. And so the EMs are mostly monitoring. They're not doing things the whole time, although clearly they were answering the phone and whatever, they were doing some things. And then the forecasters are kind of constantly assessing all the data coming in, looking at every model update, like they're doing a lot of things. So then, okay, let's say in this example, a watch gets issued. There's a flurry of activity. The EMs have several things they're going to do. And then maybe there's a forecast update and the EMs kick in and do various things. So there's a big contrast in the active versus monitoring element between emergency managers and forecasters. And that was an element of the inspiration for what we're calling the brief vulnerability overview tool that I will talk about as project number 4. 12:15, a sheriff deputy asked what level the EOC was at. So this is different activation levels. And they said it was at a 3, which means staffed. And at that point, they decided they would probably open the storm shelters at 4. Okay, however, at 1:46, Weather Service radioed that there was a tornado watch coming that would include this county. It would last until 9 p.m. The EMs were not thrilled with that. It's not quite 2. This is going to last till 9. That's a long time. Now, this is a big deal because upon issuance of a tornado watch, EMs in Alabama open their public tornado shelters. And they need to make defendable decisions. So if you think about it, if there's a tornado watch, how could you defend not opening the shelters? But sometimes weather won't occur in the area for many hours. So they have to be ready. That costs time, it costs money, it costs time and money of other people as well, because somebody has to man each one of these shelters. So they need to adapt. That's another piece of that. All right, so I have not talked much about how Jack and I would occasionally text each other through these events, but here at 3:08, there's a notable one that right as the EOC is dead quiet, you could hear a pin drop. Jack texts and says, a fresh forecaster just arrived, and what the outgoing person said was, it could fire anytime. I guess in the EOC, I didn't say that. I didn't say it out loud. They didn't know that I had that message, but they were also just like on edge, waiting for things to start happening. 4:09, the county commissioner came back. EMs joked they should put me on the payroll because it seemed like when I was there, the storms didn't form. I was like, sure. Okay. 4:30 p.m., a cell pops up on the radar to the southwest, and the EM said, that's the one, Miss Daphne. That's going to get you what you want. That's our track. 3 hours till it gets here. Well, that cell died. 4:34 p.m., EM director turned on all the TVs, starting with the Weather Channel, which I found interesting to hear what Greg Forbes was saying. In my perspective, it seems like Weather Channel is always pretty general, but in the Southeast, they feel like it addresses their needs more so than I had ever noticed anywhere I've lived. Okay, so they looked at Weather Channel, and then they looked at all the other local stations, and then kept the TVs on the rest of the event. And then this is just an example. It's not from this event, but they do things like play. So this is an image from Barron ThreatNet, and they'll grab onto something somewhere and draw a line out. If that makes it to me, how long is that going to take? If this makes it to me, how long is that going to take? So it's kind of a simplistic look, but they are dying to get more information on timing and expectations. All right, so moving on. So a couple hours later, there's a lot of background tension as these cells kind of they form, they start to move that way and die. And there's another cell popping up as we approach 5 o'clock, and then it weakened. And then there had been some messages in NWS chat, which is what the Weather Service uses to communicate with emergency managers all through the day. There'd been a few, but this was the first one that really addressed their county. And so here it is around 5 o'clock, just a quick update. Dryline surface features are now here. The latest sounding shows a very favorable environment for rotating supercells with deep layer shear, strong low-level curving hodograph. The deputy EM read that out loud and looked at me intently and said, decipher that. Okay, so, all right. After this, the sheriff deputy swung around. He's looking at the radar again. No one is on their phone at this point. The EM has his face in his hand. He wiped his face, he put his finger on his nose, he's staring at the radar, he's fidgety, like everybody is kind of tense. In the background interviews, EMs had told me things like, if storms are tornadic in the western part of the state, they probably won't be here, and vice versa. And the storms had not been tornadic yet, which is part of this tension they were feeling. Cells finally started moving through the county after 5. There hadn't been any reports yet. And a ham radio operator radioed in that, people might complain that we shut schools and businesses, and if we don't get anything. And the EM's like, that's the downside of this. It could end up being a big forecast for a non-event. At 6:12, the EM excitedly said, come here, you gotta come outside and look at the clouds. Well, there were highly backed winds. There were scud clouds flying across the valley, highly backed. And we went back inside. They had all their tower cams up. There was a nice looking cloud base. They asked me, is that a wall cloud? I'm like, no, it's a good looking cloud base though. By 6:52, as we're approaching 7 o'clock, the last time they'd had a tornado, it had happened like this. And then there was a cell a few minutes later that was in the same place that back in April 3rd or 8th, they couldn't remember, in 1973, one had plowed through the valley and hit a school. So these were part of this tension they were feeling. In the end, I'm sorry, this was Vortex Southeast, no tornadoes. Quarter-size hail to the south end of town, pea-sized hail at the EOC. They stayed vigilant to the end. This is after 7 o'clock. Remember that a couple of them had gotten there at 7 that morning. So they're tired. And it was still a little while before they were officially cleared from the watch. So you can understand, I think, how they kind of develop an amiable distrust of forecast information. They know the Weather Service is doing what it can, but the science and detection capability just aren't there for everything to be as good as it should be. A lot of forecasts fail. They get no notice events and they get null events, of course, to everyone, but it just was really palpable there with the high shear, low cape storms they have. It's a little bit different than here. So the EMs that had the least amount of trust tended to consult multiple WFOs and other sources. I didn't see it that event, but they do. And they tend to kind of look across all the forecasts and sort of treat them kind of like in an ensemble way. It's kind of interesting to see. Okay, so I think my favorite EM, Rachel and I, this is the only project we've had the time and funding to do this, but we really should do it like every time. Take their results back to your participants and present them and say, what do you think? And one of my EMs, he's like, you are dead on. Others, though, were kind of like scowls and crinkled brows because the term we used was an amiable, there's the positive, but distrust. They did not like that word. It's too negative. So if you read the paper in Weather, Climate, and Society that Rachel and I wrote, we talk that all out and we tell you what we did and how we had to come up with a different term. All right, project number 4 is about the brief vulnerability overview tool. What it was created by Jack Friedman and me. It was a vulnerability tool. It's basically a map of like what keeps you up at night. The data come from Weather Service forecasters and emergency managers. They are points or polygons that rise above a background vulnerability, and they are hazard specific. It was inspired by things like these field observations. It aims to improve the frequency and content of messaging to emergency managers and assist in closing some of these information gaps. And there's a QR code here for a story map, but if you miss getting that, you can ask me later. How is this different from vulnerability tools that are already out there? The CDC has its social vulnerability index. It looks across a lot of factors and it is completely weather agnostic. So you could have poor housing, but it's on a hill. That's not a flood threat. But that's not how it looks. We, though, the BVOT, are looking very specifically at how a vulnerability intersects with a specific hazard. CDC's vulnerability is averaged and mapped across a census tract, and on the left there, you can see that some of those tracts get to be really big. Ours is very specific to the location of a particular vulnerability. CDC, you could say it's an objective data set, but there is no such thing. They're still subjective of what's decided to put in it. Ours is also subjective, but it's very subjective to the particular people involved and what they are concerned about. So the bigger areas on the BVOT map here are things like poor low-level radar coverage or poor cell. And then you can see most of the BVOT points and polygons are quite small. Okay, the main interview prompt initially, the way we initially did this was we would sit down with people and ask them, if you were facing a severe risk later today, let's say a tornado, what would you be most concerned about in terms of vulnerability to people, places, or things? And we would do that for whatever the major weather hazards were in that area. Some would find their way on more than one map, but some of these vulnerabilities would only be subject to one hazard. So what gets plotted? Well, not every school, especially in Alabama, where some of the schools built since 2011 are ICC 500, FEMA 361 compliant. They have a legit storm shelter in the school. Are you going to think about that school in the same way as the one with temporary classrooms? No. So you would think about putting the one with temporary classrooms on the map. You would not put every flood-prone road segment because a lot of those are nuisance and you can go around them. But there were instances of, well, if this floods, the first responders can't get into that neighborhood. That's an issue. You wouldn't do the whole highway, but you would put that stretch where there's a curve and there are tall trees, and in the winter that stays icy and they have a lot of traffic accidents there. Could you use bigger data sets to help put together a BVOT? Maybe, and here's an example. There are vulnerabilities everywhere in Alabama. This particular county alone had 8,132 mobile and manufactured homes. But that is the background vulnerability. However, he colored these by the ones that are more than 12 minutes drive from a public storm shelter. So you might be able to take some of these big data sets and like parse them out in a smart way to think about, well, you could map the north end of that county in the BVOT. All right, Jack and I have been teleporting, trudging, and bridge building across the research to operations valley of death, that transition valley of death. The teleporting is we were inspired to create the BVOT and did it with 2 forecast offices in Alabama. They have a BVOT and they're using it. We're also trudging across the valley with our hazardous weather testbed grant, if you will. We've had 46 forecasters, and of the EMs, you know, they have things come up. So about 35 of our 51 went through at least 6 cases, I think is how we figured that out. There were 8 total cases. They've given us a ton of insightful observations, important ideas. They've delineated some requirements for us that we're putting together. And then we are bridge building right now with a methods grant, meaning it's a grant specifically to work on how can you put these together. And so we're working on that with 4 hazard diverse WFOs, and we have actually put in another proposal because we realized there are ways we need to streamline this that we can't do with our current grant. And so we've put in another proposal just this last cycle. So here's a couple tidbits about what our forecasters and emergency managers have said about the BVOT. And that picture there in the upper left shows a circulation kind of right where I've clipped it to the left. And then you can see BVOT points, this whole string of them, some circles and polygons on the right. And the forecaster is saying, you know, storms aren't going to hit every area, especially a tornado. It's very isolated. And up on the upper right, when looking at the BVOT tool, they noticed this high concentration of vulnerable things along I-65 corridor. And they said, you know, the BVOT actually helped increase our confidence to issue a tornado emergency. And then the quote on the bottom there is a forecaster lamenting he was going home, which was, it's going to be weird not having the BVOT. I am spoiled. I feel like I'm going to be sitting there thinking, what am I missing? What vulnerable areas should I be discussing that I'm not anymore because I don't know and I feel like I'm going to be negligent when I go home? Okay. EMs had some similar kinds of things. On the upper left, it's basically their perspective of the same idea that a tornado impact is really small. And having the BVOT would really help to understand where that tornado might have been and what they need to be alert to and maybe sending first responders out to. And they also brought up that the Mama Cat Rescue is one of these animal rescue places. And if people go to a storm shelter, they usually cannot take an animal with them, but EMs are required by law after Katrina to have places people could take their animals if they want to. And this is one of those. So it's a response resource. And they said, boy, to be able to know that there might be a tornado going over one of my response resources, woo, that is well above any capability we've ever had before. It's because the forecasters knew about it. They knew where it was because it had gotten plotted on the map. And then at the bottom there, the EM is talking about mutual aid. And they said, having this kind of information would be really helpful instead of another person having to give me a list. It would give me an idea ahead of time of what they might be asking for. And then in general, where did this quote come from on that third slide? The real world is the real test. This EM said, hey, you know what? You really have to kind of get this to us in real time. Let us destroy it a little bit, tear it up, and then say, okay, that didn't quite work out like you said, but if you fix it here, send it back, that would be outstanding. Thanks. All right, now, project number 5. I know this is what some of you are here for. My interest in this is a long-standing interest from when that report came out in 2000. Yeah, I'll get to that again. This is the Building Performance Assessment Report of the May 3rd, 99 tornadoes here in Oklahoma. The motivation for this project is to put together the forensic engineering of the structures with wind engineering and social science data. Traditional post-tornado investigations, for example, have only looked at the exterior and only looked at the final condition. There's very little information on initiation of damage, timing of breaches, propagation of failures, things like that. So what we're trying to do is analyze data, characterize risk factors, determine the efficacy of best available sheltering, identify influences on decision-making, and learn about coping. And ultimately what we want to do is be able to transfer findings on survivability and sheltering to what's called the Integrated Warning Team, IWT, which would be National Weather Service, as well as TV broadcasters and emergency managers. Here's where we've been able to get data so far. COVID. Thanks, COVID. We got a couple deployments right before the COVID shoes dropped. And then there were 3 deployments that we did not do, but we were able to test our protocol and how well an engineer could do the social science part. And then we did a couple deployments together again here late last year and early this year. And then in the parentheses there, I would call those kind of our best trifectas of data where we've got the structure, wind, and social. Here's an example of those. This is from Frank Lombardo at UIUC. His analysis there is that box where I've got the tree line marked in the upper left. And then the houses are just a little bit east and northeast of that spot. So my interviews are over there relative to his analysis. And then David Rouge at Auburn, he's been looking at the directional damage patterns and looking at things like the wind speed versus the direction that wind was coming from so that we can identify where the direction the winds were coming from when they impinged upon that house. And boy, is that complicated. So the house there kind of in the middle, you would think that the garage would have failed, and it did, the door did start to fail, but the worst damage on that house was on the north side of it. Okay, so we've been looking hard at things like what do people see, hear, and feel? It's part of our interview protocol. So here, when we get close to the tornado center line, you see how a lot of them were describing kind of a whoa, 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 or some kind of a pulsing sound, where other survivors are talking about a constant roar. Initially, when we first heard this in Lee County, Alabama, we thought that maybe it was just having to do with the response of the manufactured home structure that someone was in, but now we're seeing these differences across very similar stick-built houses. And then what they were feeling also was different. Instant pressure on the ears, the house was squeezing, inner ear pressure when the windows broke, didn't feel anything in the laundry room. Felt like my breath was taken away. That house there on the right by the tornado center line was damaged very heavily. They had pressure and then they felt like they were being lifted. Their house was pretty well torn apart. So we're still analyzing things like that. And then we're also looking at what they can tell us about what the weather was doing. So was there a trailing smaller tornado? There is evidence of it on radar that Tony Liza sent me, but further east than where this interview is. This person said, it felt like the roof was going. I got up, I sat at the table, I didn't look out. And it's a good thing I didn't because I'd probably have had a heart attack. It was coming this way. There was another one coming. It was 2 that came over. I heard another big sound, but not as big as the first one. And then here in Cookeville, Tennessee, multiple vortexes were observed by some retired firefighters from Ohio. right as the tornado was coming into this neighborhood area. And Frank sees that evidence for it in his wind analysis as well. And this person said, well, maybe that one we heard initially was like a little satellite tornado or something. I was already started back up when we ran back down because it really started pushing and shaking at that point. And then here we've got a firefighter in Bowling Green, and I've got the map over here because I do not know. There were 2 tornadoes near where he was, but it could have also been RFD. I'm not really sure. Inflow winds? I don't know. Anyway, he says, we got in the fire truck, and I remember saying to my crew, hey, we're going to wait to open the door. So they had just gotten a fire call they were running out to. I'm going to wait to open the doors until the last minute because I know there's tons and tons of wind. So I finally open it up. We're in a huge fire truck that's like 50,000 pounds. You could feel it from inside the fire truck, how much the wind was rushing through the station. A couple minutes later at the site of the call, he's like, I am underneath the truck holding on to one of the tires because the wind was so strong. My ears were popping. The wind was just insane. And then as soon as it happened, it died. And then later in the interview, he says, yeah, the guys on the roof, which he said they were trying to tie themselves onto the roof. Now I ended up in a hotel in one of my subsequent visits to Kentucky. And I was with someone who had been a fireman and was now working for the state. And I said, how long would that have been from getting to the station and then parking and like being on the roof? And he's like, oh, it easily could have been like 2 minutes. Like, really? Oh yeah, because every person has a job. So the guy that's driving parks the truck. The other guys are off that truck with a ladder on the roof really fast. So this might have been just a couple minutes time. Okay, so survivors can tell us a lot of really interesting things. In this particular home, they could identify 4 distinct channels of wind that had gone through their house by what moved and where it ended up, and what was broken. They had done several enhancements above code, which is really interesting. They had hurricane clips on part of their roof, but not all of it. And is that how a computer monitor got out of this room and was smashed at my feet? That was one of the things they talked to me about. They said, I don't know how this came out. We can't figure out how it came out of the house. The window's not broken. And then here, so that was the front left of the house, the front right of the house. There were sweaters in the attic above this room that had come out of a dresser in this room. Yeah, isn't this so? People sometimes have just amazing things to tell us. And then complexity of internal wind flow. Apparently the wind in this house breached the 2nd floor where they had finished off part of their attic, broke through that down into the 1st floor and then out because it pushed that wall out. And then some of the things that the debris was coming down and out through that area. And by the way, for those of you with little kids, I had a little kid, he's now 15 and a half, but she had just gotten her grandbaby out of that crib minutes before this happened. All right, so we have multiple studies at different analyses. I've mentioned several of them already. I'm analyzing our interview protocol. This is what it is. It's based on World Trade Center study, and Erica Kuligowski used it at NIST and Joplin. So we start out just saying like, hey, tell me what happened here from when you first knew about the tornado until it hit. And then we have question sets about different things, including the engineering, messaging, monitoring weather, and their actions for sheltering. So I'm looking through that now at like, what were they interested in? What are they remembering more clearly and less clearly? What do they most want to talk to us about? And is this protocol effective for a non-social scientist? So I've got those interviews, for example, where David was by himself. And he did a good job. So there's the short answer. And then I'm trying to also identify principles that underlie this, because anytime you create something, people will adapt it and they'll modify it. So I want to, when I publish this, also identify some of the important principles that I think are there. And so we've got these question sets that allow us to kind of come and go from emotionally charged topics. And that's been really useful in the field. When you realize they're about to start crying, you just try to like shift it over to something a little less traumatic, and then kind of circle back around when they're feeling more comfortable. And then here's an example of how with order of damage, we have to do some reassembling. Not just because of the way we're doing this, but people don't know what you're interested in. So they'll tell you some things, but not everything initially until you start asking questions. Then they realize, oh, you're more interested in that. Okay, I'll tell you more. So here you can see the 3rd and 4th bullet are part of the initial story. But later I put together pieces of what happened before those two things and then after those two things. Okay. So when we talk to people, we have a whole packet of handouts we give them. David and I put together this about building better and having safe rooms, and thank you to the National Weather Service in Norman for putting these pages together. We include them about dealing with storm anxiety, and then we also have national resources because I can print those and take them anywhere in the country. I'd love to also have local, but that's not easy to do right after a disaster, to find those. And so our resources come from a whole bunch of places. That last one is, in our initial interviews, we didn't know about it, but we added a handout from a National Child Trauma Group about helping children who've been through a tornado. Okay, so back to my longstanding interest of how I could vividly imagine how my house would fall apart. Now I can imagine what it would feel like when it does. Of course, I might not be there because Jim and I will probably be out looking at the storm somewhere. All right, so it's time for a hot wash, not a tornado wash. We're here in the last couple slides. Okay, wading through the research swamp, kind of a meta view of it. It's been really fun to explore some long-held curiosities. I found that my meteorology background is both an asset and a liability. There are a lot of things I don't have to ask about, and I'm not being blown away by the complexity of this field. However, I have to be really mindful of not making assumptions and making sure I'm asking a lot of questions, not playing dumb so much, but making sure I know what they are thinking rather than me putting my experiences onto this. And then, you know, there's been real power in having a series of grants that Jack and I have had because and then from my previous hazardous weather testbed work with Chris and Jimmy, because that has allowed for much deeper learning about the emergency managers and what they deal with. And then there's a real power in collaboration that Jack and I have had, where we can listen to the pain and try to ease that pain, so to speak. Research has been a methodological adventure, and I know there are several physical scientists in the room, and I figured there would be, which is why I put this slide in here. There are books. There are lots of books. This is a tiny fraction of what I have in my office. That's not really the case in meteorology, but there are so many methods out there in the social sciences. So there's a lot of ways to learn about them besides, of course, doing things like I've talked to Robert Hoffman and gotten some great advice from him. Challenges to doing this work? Soft funding treadmills. It was just so much fun. And then early on, we basically underscoped everything because we had to meet a budget limit. Budget limits are a little bit better, but still pretty easy to underscope a project, partly because administrative time sinks have gotten worse over time. And then this is a little bit unrelated, but I'm working in ad hoc teams across organizations. Like Jack is with the Center for Applied Social Research. So that is what it is. And then with Cassandra Shivers-Williams leaving, and now Jack is also leaving, I am taking on PI-ship of 4 grants, and I was already PI on 4 grants. So I now have this huge cognitive load of switching between these projects, and that is challenging. Everything took, even before that, everything took longer than the time available. So although I want to do all the things, I can't do all the things. Okay, so in conclusion, when I look across all the things I've done, and I'm not ready to retire yet. When I was putting this together, I kind of felt like it seems like this closure thing. But it was a really cool opportunity to kind of look back over 15 years and think, wow, I've done a lot. And I didn't even share a lot of what I did. So it just, I highlighted 5 of, I don't know how many different things. I've been able to develop and better support meteorologists to help them do more effective decision support and push the state of the science forward. And I've helped understand EM decision challenges and try to improve the system's ability to help them prepare and respond, especially when hazards are intersecting with vulnerable populations. And then with the survivor work, we're really hoping to better understand insights into the structures and what's failing to make sure that engineering conclusions are correct and that we're giving the right advice on where people should shelter. And then it will also, it just is helping us understand a non-meteorologist's point of view on what's happening in the weather. So I'm going to switch to this one, which has all the QR codes on it, and then I'll come back. And it's time, if you have any questions, I'd love to hear them.
Thank you very much. That presentation is open for questions.
Excellent work. Thank you for doing it. I guess I want you to give me a question mark, like comment on one, how did you build these relationships with EM? And then secondly, how do researchers deal with, participant fatigue, like, this is a group that everyone is interested in, and you keep going back to them to help them, but also still putting a lot of pressure on them. So how do you deal with that as well?
That's a very good question. And thanks to Elisa's defense earlier today, I'm going to try to repeat the question, which was, how do we build relationships with emergency managers and not give them fatigue in I go to them and then you go to them and then someone else goes to them. Yeah, how do we do that? So I would say, initially I used two ways of connecting with EMs. One was weather service forecast offices. So we were probably getting the more weather salient and weather interested EMs, which is a liability of those studies. And then with James Hawker here at the Oklahoma Mesonet, he helped connect us to a lot of EMs across Oklahoma. With Vortex Southeast, it was an easy sell, as you might imagine from what I presented. The no notice events, adapting their procedures, forecasts are really tough. They were very open to talking with me for extended periods of time. And they're like, oh yeah, you can come. Like I would call before an event, can I go to your EOC? And they would all say yes, but I could only go to one. So those are my answers. So personal networks to reach people in the first place. And then with some of our later studies, we're trying to make sure we're hitting the non-weather salient EMs if we can. It's a little bit challenging, yeah, but so I leave it to them to, most of the opportunities we've had, they have had an opportunity to decide and reach out to us if they wanted to participate. Yeah, so then they're choosing and they're apparently not the fatigued ones. Yeah, so that's a really important question and thing to think about. Looking nationwide helps a lot, and looking at the county level, I'm not even sure how many counties there are in the US, but it's a lot. That helps.
Good question.
Where do you see this intersection moving forward?
Oh, wow. So the question was one of those like big picture ones of where do I see this intersection of social science and meteorology going in the future? Kim would probably give a much better answer than I would. Hi, Kim. But, I also think each one of us would have different things to add to a big list. There's a ton of interest in the National Weather Service about how to better meet and understand the needs of the people they're trying to serve. I could even see the value of every forecast office having opportunities to engage with social scientists. And so in some of our studies, we tried to reach out to offices we didn't think had already done a lot because we know there's a lot of interest out there. I don't know if that's a great thorough answer, but you're asking me a question that like tomorrow I'll have a better answer for you, right? That's a good question. You know where to find me. Yeah, Beth that asked the question is one of Jackson, my postdocs.
Other questions?
And let me see. If there are any.
So you talked about your background in meteorology being both a benefit and then a liability in some regard. I was curious, like your background in adult education, is that a benefit? How do you see that benefiting? Is there a liability there?
And the question was, so my meteorology background is both a benefit and a liability. What about my background in adult education? Because that's what I had chosen to do for my dissertation, for my PhD work. And that was motivated by the pain of knowing that EMs were really struggling to understand things like radar. And so I went in with that interest, and it's one of my little toy ideas of when I retire, maybe that would be something that would be kind of fun to put together a training for EMs. I don't know. By the way, you need to write those kinds of things down when you're not unemployed, because when you're unemployed, you probably won't be able to think of them. So I have a list going. So the adult education is interesting because education does not have a really strong foundation of understanding. Like meteorology, there are fundamental physics of the atmosphere. That's not so common in social sciences, and in education in particular, it's a very shifty foundation. So ideas get really popular in education and they're the thing for a while, but then it shifts away because that foundation was not very solid. And that you keep some of those ideas, but you expand and move to kind of a new foundation. And that happens a lot in education in general. One of the things that it's given me here's the asset. Besides just being an empathetic person, which is a liability, it has really helped me hear things that my participants tell me. So recently I was talking with Alan Gerard and I said, you know what, we teach people that when they're in a warning, nothing's going to happen to them. We teach them that because that's what happens. And he's like, yeah, and you're right. Hadn't thought about it with quite that angle. So it's given me a couple of opportunities to think like that. Adult education expertise, building expertise. So thinking about emergency managers that do and don't have some expertise about how to deal with weather. I've brought that in. They are building expertise through experiences. So there you've got kind of your naturalistic decision-making that Gary Klein. So there are some lenses like that I bring in that I think are unique to some of the other social scientists here that have some other really important things they bring to the table. But hopefully all these different lenses are like spotlights. And when you put them all on the thing, you'll get a much better view of what it is. So there's definitely room for lots of studies from lots of different angles on the same kinds of things.
Thank you for all of this. It's a great retrospective, and you're such a good storyteller. It's really enjoyable. And it's right around the other questions. I'm going to ask you a big, broad, perspective question too, and it's about, our children. We talked a lot about trying to cross the valley of death through social science research. When do you feel that we know enough to transition our knowledge and apply it? And part of what I'm asking was, I was struck by the emergency managers and forecasters of FEMA. And they wanted to use that tool, which you talked about how that knowledge is like sort of partial and situated to the people who actually gave that. And they're kind of wondering about, okay, well, what is my toolkit to do something to help these people? And, is it ready to transition now, or should it be that then we actually trick the vulnerable populations and say, hey, just because you live within X miles of a shelter, does that mean we should map you? Or, how many voices need to come to bear before a tool is ready?
Okay, so to try to repeat all of that for the audience, tell me what I missed, okay? The question was also kind of big, broad, and it had to do with transitioning research to operations, and it had to do with how do you know when it's ready to go? And in the specific example, it had to do with the BVOT, and there are very specific things that are mapped on there, but they were mapped by this EM, and there have been some retirements, and even a couple of EMs have passed on that helped us build the BVOT, and there's a whole new EM working in that county. So how do we know that it's still salient? Well, so that part of that is updating and making sure that when you think about a tool, that there is a plan in place for updating things. So that deals with part of that. But the reason we did the hazardous weather testbed project was, wow, this has some great face validity. This is doing some really important things, but let's step back because we teleported across the valley of death. And are there unintended consequences and some other things like that? So the part of the philosophy behind the BVOT is we're not going to map everything, because if we did, forecasters can't use it. There's too much on it. The EMs, they're talking specifically to the EMs. This is not designed for the general public, although it could influence messaging to the public, but it's for the EMs who know a lot about their county and helping them know, like, this is going just north of the mama cat rescue. They could be thinking, oh, well, then it's hitting this. And that wasn't on the BVOT, but the forecaster didn't need to know that. So the idea is that there's enough on there that it helps the Weather Service message maybe more and in addition to, but it's not ever going to be complete because that's not the Weather Service's job. Yeah, you're nodding and you want to say something. Go ahead.
With the comment I was thinking of in particular was the quote about, forecasters were motivated to ensure tornado alert. So vulnerability isn't just like an inherent quality in person, but it's situational. And one of the things to think about lead time is vulnerability can be integrated. And you get somebody maybe from a vulnerable housing unit to offer in time. And, there's a question of, well, the time of the tornado emergency being issued, is that useful to the vulnerable people? Or are we motivating people to flee into a tornado? Like, that's the kind of thing where you're seeing forecast offices want to do something, that's something they think they have in the arsenal, does it actually help the vulnerable population sit in line with what they want? This is where I struggle so much as a social scientist in this space, just really was interested in your perspective on, like, stepping back a second, like, knowing when something is ready to transition, then whose voices need to be at the table to make a determination. And it sounds like what you're suggesting is maybe it's enough to have emergency managers and forecasters, but maybe you're unsure. And I think that's just where I am too. It can be something to do with each one of the things we want to transition. It's just an interesting social concept.
Yeah, okay. And I'll try to summarize that there's still several people online. We should be running a mic back. So the idea of who's not being served by the BVOT, and a lot of your perspective is coming from the publics, which is not what we were thinking of and not the communication span that we were hitting with the BVOT. But the point of there would be vulnerable populations and things. So here's an example that complements what you're trying to say. It's not what you said, but it's it complements it really well. It gives you some data behind it, which is that there were some EMs that were biased to telling me, well, most of my tornadoes are in that part of the county. And it'd be like, yeah, but what if there was a tornado over here? What would keep you up at night? And so there are a lot of potential issues with how that data set is being put together. I think it comes down to that the BVOT is helping do nudging. And it's not, so there's still the base meteorology, which is a lot of what you research. And that is so hugely important. And the other points you made about, is this what the vulnerable populations need? Is it what they want? Is it actually helping when it's a tornado emergency? Like, who does that help? Those are all fantastic questions that I don't think really hit for the BVOT very much. It's kind of there's some overlap, but there's a whole other realm there that you're bringing up. And I forget what else I was going to say about that. But yeah, so again, the BVOT is a nudge. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be everything. The problem that we saw that kind of triggered the whole thing is that it gets to the forecaster hedge gap that Jack has identified in working with forecasters, watching them work. If I challenged a forecaster and said, okay, but is it going to go here or here? They'd say, I kind of think it's going to go over here, but they don't want to just share that without being asked. So there's a little bit of an element of if you have some nudging in there, the forecasters might share a few things a little bit faster to the EMs. And that's kind of the space that the BVOT is working in. So what are the liabilities to that? Well, the test bed may not have told us what those were. Sounds like NOAA should put in a social science call in the future to go back to places that have a BVOT and try to study some of those things, to see if it's being used, are there unintended consequences? Otherwise, before that, we would have to speculate based on other kinds of studies, perhaps that you have done, that could really add valuable things to that conversation.